Fireside chat. So it's only befitting that to spearhead the chat, I please invite on stage Ashmit Kumar, anchor and deputy editor, CNBC TV 18. Can we also have a thunderous round of applause? Because we're all set for this very invigorating chat coming your way. So with that, Ashmit, over to you.
I think just moments before this conversation, we were having a conversation, Professor and I, just over lunch, and he said they've only given me 10 minutes for a keynote. That's just about enough for me to clear my throat. But I think you've done a good job of that. You've set the context quite well.
My throat is clear.
But let's talk about a few of the points that you raised, Professor. And I want to bring in the aspect of the game verification framework. I want to talk about that in context of the recent developments. When I say recent, I mean the last, say, 36 to 48 months, that a lot of conversation around whether a game is of chance or whether a game is of skill is a job that we've found the courtrooms doing. Is that the ideal situation? Is that the way we should be going towards? And I also want to look at this framework of distinguishing between games of chance and skill from a regulatory perspective as well. You mentioned that regulations should be enablers. They should not be dissuading innovation. So just from both these lenses, a look at this framework, how does it work, how will it help?
Okay, there are two parts to this question. The first one is about the courts, right? Now, remember, we are a rule of law society. We follow common law, and in common law, the only thing that the courts can do is if there is a dispute, right? So the courts are not executors. You know, they don't go out and implement anything. So even if I'm doing something which is atrocious, the court should not step in, though nowadays the Supreme Court has stepped in what they call suo motu cases. But in principle, they're not supposed to, right? So somebody has to take the dispute to the courts. Okay. Now this essential, and since the court has to, and we have this whole backlog of cases, so this creates a very, very uncertain situation for any innovator. That anybody and their grandfather, no sexist comments. Grandfather may file a case against some game, and then you have to wait for 3 years before it is settled, even if it is thrown out, right? So that you don't want. Sure. In a fast-changing world, you don't want the courts to be deciding on economic activities. That's a no-no, absolutely not. On the other hand, I must also say the courts are really not trying to do that, right? So we may have that perception, but in all fairness, they have not, because they have just said games of chance, games of skill, and they do not themselves decide whether it's a game of chance or a game of skill. They do depend on experts. So, that's a different issue. The second question that you asked was more on enabling versus, see, the thing is that I'm reminded of, I don't know how many of you know about the DOTS program, which is, I'm sure you know, it's the TB treatment regimen, right? The DOTS program was actually, the study for the DOTS was done in India. And India was the one that didn't adopt it till WHO in the 80s. This was done in the 60s. We didn't adopt it. Why? Because our question was, has it been tried anywhere else? And obviously it hasn't, because it was an innovative idea. But these people, the stupid people, professors, as you know, they're not very smart. So they published their work, even though everybody said throw it away. And some others, as is again usual in India, somebody from outside picked it up. So WHO introduced it. It was a huge success. So in the 80s, when India approached the WHO for funding, they said you have to implement DOTS. So that is, what I mean by enabling. You have to encourage people to take risks. You have to encourage people to do new things. Sure. You cannot tell people who are doing new things, prove yourself. That's the thing that regulators should be aware of. As I said, let people do whatever they want. If you think something wrong is happening, you step in. Mm-hmm. In other words, regulators need to be more on the ball. Because what regulators are doing now is just saying, I don't know, don't do it. You give evidence that it's a good thing, only then I'll allow you to do. That's no way for an innovative country to progress. So that's the point that I was trying to make.
I think it's an interesting thought that you're putting across, that the burden of proof, it seems, lies on the innovators to establish that, look, I'm not in violation of any laws or any norms. That's an interesting proposition that you've put forth. But since you did make a mention of innovators, let's speak of it in that lens, in that sense. When we speak of innovators, how relevant is this framework? Not only from a policy-making tool, we've looked at it from, of course, from the lens of a policymaker. I want to look at it from the lens of an innovator, of a developer. How relevant and how critical is it when I, as a developer or as an innovator, will have very clear-marked guidelines, guardrails that will tell me that this is kosher and that this is not. It will allow me that sense of certainty and clarity so as to be not met with some kind of regulatory hurdle in the future.
See, there are two things we have to be careful about. One is processes. Regulators should, really not try to get into processes. That's why I said outcomes, right? What are the outcomes of the game? Is the outcome creating a problem? Or the innovation? I shouldn't say game because we are talking a little bit generally over here, right? So if any innovative activity is taking place, what is the outcome of the innovative activity? Think about all the financial instruments that were developed. Imagine if everybody thought about the process of financial instruments, none of them would have been discovered. New instruments are discovered, sometimes they lead to the 2008 crisis, so people regulate it. Right? But if you want to develop new things, you cannot, underline design the process by which it has to be developed. So that's the first thing that we have to understand, that we have to be focused on outcomes. And hence, what we call ex post, right? After the event, you have to step in. So that those who are designing, they know that if this, they are the best people who know what outcome can happen, not you and I, because we are not in that thing designing it. One of the reasons why you have full liability in many instances, for example, in pharma companies in the US, you have full liability. Why? The argument given there is that it is the drug developing company which has the maximum information about the drug. And hence, the liability should be on that person who has the maximum. I'll give you an example. There are two examples. I'll give only one for consideration of time. There was a car called Ford Pinto, right? Which is developed by Ford. This is after the first oil shock, when the Japanese started invading the US auto market, because they could produce small fuel-efficient cars, which the Americans were not used to producing. Therefore, they started this whole redesigning their auto plants, and the Ford Pinto was made. For 2 years in a row, it won the prize for the best designed car in the world. And then that car had to be withdrawn, and Ford was sued. Why? Because there was a design flaw in that car, in the sense that if somebody hit it from behind, the petrol tank or the gasoline tank, the gas tank as they call it, that exploded. So that was a design flaw. They could not say that, but you gave us the prize for the best designed car in the world for 2 years in a row. Not an excuse. So there are reasons for doing it this way. So if you want an innovative economy, you have to start thinking like this. You have to allow people to do and quickly step in, and minimize the loss if there is something bad. You cannot from before decide that I'll only have the good things. This is like saying every company must make a profit. Then nobody will be making a profit. That's what happened with planned economies, right? You need the churn in economic activity for new things to happen, for profits to be made.
That's an interesting insight as to ex post versus ex ante. That's a good example of how you've demonstrated about how the need for encouraging innovators rather than disabling them. But let's take it forward. Let's also talk about it from a regulatory perspective. We've considered the policymaker lens. We've considered the innovator lens. Now let's look at it from a regulator's perspective. This framework, what guardrails would you suggest that regulators need to bear in mind to ensure that there is no capture of this system, that there is no abuse of this framework of classification between games of chance and skill?
Okay, so again, as I said, because you're asking me you're asking me what to do, and I'm saying don't do those things. So please, let's be clear on that. So the mechanism that we have designed, as I said, is game agnostic, right? So it doesn't depend on the game. Secondly, it is an objective mechanism. Anybody can implement that. The gaming industry or the gaming company, the firm or whatever for each game itself can implement it, right? So you have to make it completely personality-free, company-free, as well as not case by case. So that I, as an innovator, know exactly, right? Okay, I'm following this path. And that's why I'm saying look at the outcome, because outcomes are observable. Processes are not. See, one of the big things about regulation is how accountable you are. You can only make yourself accountable if whatever you're doing is observable. How many people are going to understand what process has been found which is not keeping to the regulatory framework? There is known only between the person who has infringed on the process and the person who is looking at the process, not the people at large. But outcomes are observed by everybody. And that's what, mature societies do. Mature societies don't get into process regulation. So therefore, what is important is for the innovator to know that if this is the sort of outcome my game is going to give, it will be banned.
Interesting. Which brings me to my final question in terms of, and this, Professor, is a slightly broader question, so bear with me here. When we talk of the technology, the race between technology and legislation, race between technology and law, I think one thing that experience has taught us is that law will never be able to keep pace with the technology. Technology evolves at a much faster pace. The outcomes of tomorrow, as far as technology is concerned, are not necessarily known. You don't quite understand what the use cases of that technology tomorrow could be. It only develops over time. But yet, that is the struggle that policymakers struggle with in terms of drafting and codifying legislation, which they feel will address the challenges that are brought forth by this technology. The question I want to ask you is, how do we avoid overdoing it, where we don't bring out legislation designed to preempt the technology and the outcomes in such a manner that it, again, has a huge overhang and creates that disabling environment that you referred to in the first answer?
Well, this is a very complicated process, and I know that we in India are struggling with this, right? Because now almost every day you wake up and look at the papers, or if we read papers anymore, or look at Google News, I don't know, to try and figure out whether some new statement has been made yesterday by some regulator about how something is going to be done tomorrow, right? So you're always afraid of that the people are trying to regulate the digital economy all the time. The thing is, again, I'm sorry for repeating myself, technology, how it is going to be used. Technology has two parts, right? In fact, in the olden days, we used to distinguish between invention, discovery, and implementation. So we talked about invention and innovation. Innovation was different from invention, right? And in trying to regulate innovation, you should not block invention. That's the real issue. If you try to regulate innovation too hard or too strictly, especially the process of innovation, you're going to cut out all inventions. And this, in the 50s and 60s, economists had made a distinction between these sorts of regulations that try to get into innovations, the process of innovation. Sure. So essentially what we need to do in this context is be aware of this and understand the fact that technology, you can understand technology only after it has worked itself out. Right? And therefore, let it work itself out. If we are a mature society, why can't we stop the bad outcomes? Why can't we cover the losses of those who've had those bad experiences? If we are on the job, we should be able to do it. We used to laugh about a lot when we were the graduate students, right? That there are two ways to address a problem. One is to solve the problem. The other is to eliminate the problem. What is the concept of eliminating the problem? Oh, people can gamble in games, therefore ban games. You've eliminated the problem. Nobody is gambling. Or at least that's what you're thinking. They're all gambling under the table, right, when you're not observing. But that's the thing. We should not have this approach of anything that is bad, let us ban it. there is nothing that is all good. Everything has, something that is bad. And a mature society, good people are trained to identify those before they become too big. That's the job of the regulator. That's what we mean by expertise in regulating an economy.
We still have a couple of minutes, so just a few final thoughts, Professor. I'll come to you. We've discussed a whole host.
Please, I know that in these gatherings, it's always the final question is, can you give me 3 things? Please don't do that.
No, rather I was actually hoping for a little insight as to what help us gaze into the future, help us gaze into the crystal ball. We're standing at the cusp of a lot of disruptive technologies. I just want to get a sense that from the current regulatory framework that we have, the pace of development that we have, the technologies that we're seeing, how do you see the gaming industry develop, especially in the Indian context? It's a unique situation here. There's a lot of demand. There's regulatory uncertainty, but at the same time, there's a lot of innovation. Startups are investing heavily in this. There's a lot of excitement as well. Help us gaze into the crystal ball.
You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. You're asking an economist to predict something. But let's try. See, the thing is that the way I see it is that we are a very young population. Very young population. We are very well-trained people. Right? And one of the good things about India is that we are highly inefficient. And therefore, even if we have rules and regulations, we know how to get around them. So I'm not worried about that. What I'm really worried about is that we also have a bad habit of becoming too suspicious of somebody who is really successful. If somebody stands out, we get too suspicious. Right? So that's the thing we have to fight. So if you ask me to see where India is going to be after 10, 20 years in the gaming industry, I think we have a lot of opportunities. In fact, if you look at many of the things that people say and many of the things that are happening here in India, unfortunately, it's not being done by Indian companies. It's being done by foreign companies, but they're being done with people in India. So I'm very hopeful if you move around and talk to people globally, they're extremely positive about what India can do. So therefore, I think that if we have been, unfortunately, focused more on the business models of innovation. Right? But you can't get up one day and say, okay, let's build universities where we will have an Einstein in every. You can't do it that way, right? To get to Einstein, you have to go step by step by step, right? So sometimes what you start doing may be very low down on the scale. But the more you do of it, that's how you get up, right? And that is what India is going through. The only thing is that in India's churn is much faster than any other economy. It's because of the number of young people that we have. So I'm extremely positive on where India will go if our regulators let it go.
And 3 things that you would like to see happen?
Well, one of the things I'd like to see is India to play the World Cup, the World Test final and win it.
I'm sure we'll get there. But thank you so much, Professor, for sharing these thoughts with us. A very lucid demonstration of some very complicated policy issues that we're currently facing, especially with respect to the gaming industry. I'd like to thank you for taking our time for speaking to us. And I think I must mention to the audience here that the professor is actually joining us after a long flight, and he landed just this morning. So despite those commitments, he's managed to show up here. So I think only demonstrates his conviction and his focus as far as the industry is concerned. So Professor, thank you once again for being a part of this, and thank you once again for joining us.